evening, everyone. Tonight we're settling into one of the strangest, glossiest, most gloriously excessive decades in American financial history. The 1980s, when Wall Street traded in more than just stocks and bonds. It traded in ego, adrenaline, and a very specific kind of self-belief that convinced grown men in pinstriped suits that the world existed largely for their benefit. Before we drift into it together, if this kind of long, slow historical wind down helps you sleep, consider following along. But only if it actually adds something to your evening. Tell me in the comments what city you're listening from and what the clock reads where you are right now. It's always something to picture all these different time zones settling into the same story together. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum somewhere in the background. And let's slip into 1985. Before we go further, ask yourself a few questions. Could you have survived a job where being unreachable for 10 minutes felt like a professional catastrophe? Could you have kept a straight face while a colleague wept over a phone call and another one threw a chair across the room, and a man named Sal tried to sell you a stake in a shipping company that may or may not exist? Would you have noticed the signs when the whole shimmering machine started to wobble? Or would you have been too busy checking your reflection in a watch you just spent a small fortune on? Let's find out. You are about to wake up in the middle of it. You wake in a Manhattan high-rise apartment, one that costs more per month than most Americans' annual salaries. And yet, somehow, you have convinced yourself this is a modest starter place. The clock reads 5 in the morning, which feels less like a time and more like an insult, especially considering you were still on the phone discussing treasury yields at midnight. Your bedroom holds all the trophies of a man with money, and absolutely no time to enjoy any of it. A sound system you've never once turned on, an exercise bike quietly serving as a place to hang your jacket, and a skyline view you're generally too busy to actually look at. Your head throbs. Your mouth carries the distinct aftertaste of ambition and last night's second bottle of wine. And your very first waking thought, before anything about family or health or the general condition of your soul, is a number. It is always a number. You lie there a moment, doing an honest inventory of your body, and the results are not encouraging. Your temples pulse. Your stomach can't decide if it's empty or simply offended by the previous evening. There's a faint ringing in your left ear that's been there roughly since 1983 and shows no interest in leaving. You got maybe 4 hours of sleep, and at least one of those hours was spent in a dream arguing with a client about a wire transfer. This, in your world, is not a problem. It is a badge of honor proof that you are essential, that the entire apparatus of American finance would grind to a halt if you dared rest past 6. You swing your legs off a bed frame that cost more than a used car, chosen entirely because a decorator once told you it would impress people who will, statistically, never see your bedroom. Your bare feet meet a marble floor so cold it feels almost like a moral judgment. Somewhere down the hall, a coffee maker set on a timer by a housekeeper you rarely cross paths with is already gurgling into life. Because the one part of your existence you fully automated is the delivery of stimulants. Everything else, laundry, plants, the general concept of rest, is either outsourced or quietly neglected until it falls apart. You stand up, sway slightly, catch yourself against the wall like a man on the deck of a ship in rough water. And here's the part a reasonable outsider would find baffling. You are not miserable. You are, in fact, faintly electric. Because underneath the hangover and the sleep debt, your brain isn't reaching for calm, it's reaching for the fight. There are deals to close today, rivals to outmaneuver, and a market opening at 9:30, whether you're ready for it or not. Every overworked, under-caffeinated cell in your body is straining toward that opening bell like a racehorse, already leaning into the gate. You catch your reflection in the mirrored closet door, and it is not a kind sight. You look like a man who has been through something, but you square your aching shoulders anyway, because in this world, appearances are the actual product you sell, and the selling starts now. Ahead of you lies a whole elaborate ritual designed to turn this crumpled, over-caffeinated wreck into something resembling a titan of finance. It involves marble counters, an unreasonable amount of hair product, and cologne applied with the subtlety of a fire alarm. But first, you have to survive the bathroom. Let's talk about the grooming ritual. Because on 1980s Wall Street, looking successful wasn't a nicety. It was armor. You step into a bathroom large enough to comfortably seat a dinner party and begin the sacred transformation. There is hair gel. There is a great deal of hair gel. Your hair gets slicked back with such aggressive precision that it looks less like a hairstyle and more like a formal declaration. The shower runs scalding hot because somewhere along the way you decided comfort was for people who lose, and pain was simply efficiency you could physically feel. You don't relax under that water, you strategize, standing there steaming and naked like a general reviewing a battle map that exists only in his head. When you step out, you don't pat yourself dry so much as attack the towel like it personally wronged you. Then comes the hair, and this is where the real craftsmanship happens. Your hair is the crown, the helmet, practically the flag you fly above the fortress of your face. Gel goes on, then more gel, until every strand is swept back and locked into place, gleaming under the bathroom lights like polished stone. It has to survive wind, sweat, panic, and a 14-hour day without a single hair daring to shift out of formation. Next, the shave with an actual blade, because disposable razors are, in your mind, for people who take the subway their whole lives without complaint. You lean close to the mirror, pull your cheek taut, and scrape away the evidence of last night's excess with grim focus. A small nick appears, a bead of blood you barely register. Then the aftershave hits, and your whole face briefly regrets existing. And for one sharp second, you feel genuinely alive. It is roughly the closest thing to meditation your schedule allows. And finally, the cologne applied not with a dab or a spritz, but with the enthusiasm of a man salting the earth so nothing else will ever grow there. The idea, as you understand it, is that your ambition should arrive in a room a full 3 seconds before you do and begin negotiating on your behalf. It is powerful. It is expensive. It is, frankly, a minor public health concern in a crowded elevator, though no one on earth is brave enough to say so to your face. You take one last look. The exhaustion is still there underneath, hollow-eyed and undeniable. But layered over the top of it now is a gleaming, fragrant, thoroughly convincing mask of success. You nod at yourself. The reflection nods back, equally unconvinced by its own performance, but willing to go along with it. You are ready. Almost, because a face this expensive deserves a body wrapped in something even more expensive. It's time to get dressed. Getting dressed in your world is not a casual affair. It's assembling armor. You reach for a suit that costs more than a small car, one of several nearly identical ones hanging in your closet, because a serious man does not waste precious brain power on wardrobe decisions when there are hostile takeovers to plan. Your suspenders, and you would never insult them by calling them anything so pedestrian, come in a bold color meant to be visible from across a room, possibly from orbit. Your tie is silk. Your collar contrasts sharply with your shirt. The entire ensemble exists to broadcast one clear message. I am extremely expensive, and you cannot afford to have an opinion about me. Start with the suit, because everything else is built around it. It's bespoke, of course. The notion of buying something off a rack, something a stranger might also own, fills you with something close to genuine horror. Your suits are cut for your body alone, by a tailor who has measured every inch of you, and whom you privately consider one of the most important relationships in your life. The shoulders are structured to make you look broader, sturdier, more like a wall that money simply bounces off of. The pinstripes run straight and confident, quietly informing everyone in the room that you are, at all times, taller and more serious than they are. The shirt is crisp white or pale blue. And here's the detail that separates the serious operators from the pretenders. The collar and cuffs are a contrasting white, sharp against the colored body of the shirt. A small flourish that says you noticed the detail and paid extra for it. The cuffs are French, closed with cufflinks worth more than a decent used car, because that tiny flash of gold at your wrist when you wave off a junior colleague is worth every dollar. Then the suspenders, clipped on with a satisfied snap. Yes, technically they hold up your trousers, but their real function is decorative aggression, patterned, colorful, sometimes stitched with tiny recurring symbols, worn visibly under a jacket left just open enough to let them show. A belt would do the same job. A belt would also be boring, and boring is the one thing your entire personality cannot survive being. The tie goes on next, knotted into a fat, confident dimple. Silk so loud it borders on hostile. Your shoes are leather, polished by someone else to a mirror shine, laced tight, and ready to march across marble lobbies with the crisp certainty of a man who has never once questioned whether he belongs there. Finally, a heavy watch slides onto your wrist, chosen specifically because other bankers will recognize the brand instantly, and everyone else won't have a clue. A secret handshake you get to wear. You stand in front of the full-length mirror and take it all in. The transformation is complete. The wreck who peeled himself off an overpriced mattress an hour ago has vanished, replaced by a gleaming, armored monument to 1980s excess. You look expensive. You look dangerous. Above all, you look like someone whose time is worth considerably more than yours. You allow yourself one satisfied breath. Then your stomach growls, reminding you that even titans, apparently, still need breakfast. Breakfast, in your world, is never a quiet bowl of cereal eaten alone. That would waste a perfectly good opportunity to intimidate somebody. It's a business meeting disguised as a meal, held at one of a small handful of restaurants where tables sit close enough together that everyone can overhear exactly how important everyone else is. You order coffee, black, and eggs you likely won't touch, because eating heartily suggests an appetite you can't spare the time for, and because you're already too wired for real hunger anyway. Across the table, a colleague talks about a deal, but you're only half listening, since the rest of your brain is running a constant calculation on whether he's lying to you. He probably is. You probably are too. The room hums with low, urgent conversation, forks clinking, waiters gliding between tables with coffee pots like something ceremonial, deals being whispered over toast that's going cold and unnoticed. Walking in gives you a small, pleasant jolt of belonging. These are your people, over-caffeinated, underslept, thoroughly convinced of their own importance. Shake hands firm, dry, a beat too long, the standard opening ritual, not unlike two rams working out who gets the hill. Small talk here is never actually small. How's the family really means, are you distracted? Busy quarter really means I'm winning, and you should worry. You mention a deal vaguely enough to imply you know something without revealing anything real, and he does the same. It's a dance, two well-dressed cats circling one bowl of cream, each waiting for the other to lunge first. The eggs arrive and go cold. Neither of you cares. This meal was never about food. It's about positioning, about visibility, about extracting one useful scrap of information while giving away nothing yourself. When the bill comes, you both reach for it in a brief, theatrical show of generosity, and whoever wins gets to feel powerful about paying, then quietly puts it on the company card anyway. You part ways on the sidewalk, already forgetting each other, the city fully awake now, and the clock in your head ticking louder. It's time to head downtown. How you get there says almost as much about you as the suit does. Maybe you sink into the leather seat of a car service, muttering about interest rates over the financial pages. Maybe, if you're still climbing, you ride the subway standing shoulder to shoulder with people you've quietly decided you've already left behind. Either way, the trip downtown isn't really a commute. It's a psychological warm-up, a chance to remind yourself that today, like every day, you intend to win, whatever winning even means by this point. Say you've made it far enough to justify the car, because that has always been the goal, and you've chased it without apology. A black sedan waits at the curb, engine idling. A driver who's long since learned your name, your route, your moods. You sink into the leather, and for one brief moment, the noise of the street disappears behind tinted glass. It's the closest thing to peace you'll get all day, and you spend it doing absolutely no relaxing whatsoever, snapping open the financial pages instead, underlining numbers, muttering, shaking your head as if the global economy has personally let you down. The car crawls through traffic that does not care in the slightest about your importance, which is its own quiet, simmering insult. You check your watch. You check it again. If you're still climbing the ladder, the reality is humbler, and you resent every second of it. You descend into the subway, gleaming and heavily cologned, and stand pressed against people you've decided, somewhere in your head, you're better than. The car is loud. It smells of things your cologne is visibly losing a war against, and you grip a pole with one hand while clutching your briefcase to your chest with the other, like a shield. You stare into the middle distance, already rehearsing the version of yourself you're about to become. One day, you tell yourself, gripping the pole tighter, it's the car every single morning. No exceptions. Whether padded in leather or crammed in among strangers, that ride downtown is the last quiet stretch before the storm. You spend it winding yourself tighter, not looser, sharpening the blade instead of sheathing it. Then the car glides to a stop, or the subway doors hiss open, and you step out into the financial district, where the buildings rise around you like the walls of a canyon carved entirely out of money. Your office tower waits ahead, tall and glittering and cold, ready to swallow you whole. Your building rises ahead of you, a tower of glass and polished stone designed for exactly one psychological effect: to make ordinary visitors feel very small, and to make men like you feel absolutely enormous. The lobby is cold and echoing, its ceilings stretched improbably high, every surface scaled just slightly too large for a human being, so that anyone walking through it senses, on some animal level, that they've wandered somewhere they don't quite belong. You, of course, stride through like you own the place, because in your mind, you very nearly do. Security guards nod at you the way men learn to nod at people who require exactly the right amount of acknowledgement. Not too much, not too little. You give the smallest possible nod back, the nod of a man too important for a full greeting, but generous enough to spare a fraction of one. He's long since calibrated exactly how much recognition men like you expect, and he delivers precisely that, and not a hair more. The elevator is its own small theater. You step in beside a cluster of other identically suited men, and the doors slide shut on a sealed box of pure, silent competition. Nobody speaks. Everybody evaluates. You clock the weave of the suit fabric to your left, the shine on the shoes to your right, the glint of a watch peeking out from a cuff across the car. In the space of a few floors, you run a lightning-fast internal ranking of every man present. Place yourself comfortably near the top and settle your face into the serene expression of someone who has absolutely not just done exactly that. They're all doing the same thing. The elevator hums upward, thick with cologne and unspoken hierarchy, and your pulse quickens with each rising floor, not from the height, but from anticipation, the way an athlete feels walking toward the field before kickoff. Men peel off at various floors, and each departure quietly reshuffles the ranking in your head. By the time the doors finally open on your floor, you're practically vibrating. The little chime sounds, the doors part, and noise hits you like a physical wall, hundreds of voices shouting over each other, phones ringing without pause, the electric crackle of pure human urgency filling every cubic foot of the room. To an outsider, it would be unbearable, the kind of environment you'd flee rather than voluntarily enter for a paycheck. To you, it is oxygen. Your shoulders drop, your jaw sets, something behind your eyes switches on. This is where you're supposed to be. You step out into the noise, weaving between desks, past junior staff sprinting with pieces of paper and men gesturing wildly into phones pressed against their shoulders. And the last fragility of the morning burns off completely. There's no room here for the hollow-eyed wreck who crawled out of an expensive bed a couple of hours ago. There is only the machine, and you are one of its most enthusiastic moving parts. Let's take a proper look at the trading floor itself, because nothing in ordinary life quite prepares you for it. Picture a room the size of an aircraft hangar, packed with hundreds of over-caffeinated men shouting at once. Phones ring constantly. Paper flies through the air. Someone is standing on a chair to be heard. Someone else, a few desks over, is hurling a phone receiver down hard enough to make the whole desk jump. The noise here isn't a distraction from the work. The noise is the work. Fortunes rise and fall in seconds, decided by shouted numbers, gut instinct, and a shared, unspoken refusal to ever look uncertain in front of anyone else. The floor stretches out in front of you, desks pushed together in long rows, each one buried under a landslide of paper, coffee cups, ringing phones, and glowing green terminals. There's no privacy anywhere, no walls, no doors, no quiet corner to retreat to. Just row after row of men shouting into telephones, at each other, occasionally at the ceiling. The air sits thick and warm, heated by hundreds of bodies and hundreds of machines, and by the sheer friction of collective, low-grade panic. It smells of burnt coffee, of cologne steadily losing ground to sweat, and yes, of cigarette smoke, because people still smoke at their desks here, ash occasionally drifting onto documents worth more money than most people will see in a lifetime. The volume itself is hard to describe to anyone who hasn't stood inside it. It isn't a hum. It's a physical pressure, a permanent low-grade avalanche of sound that you somehow learn to hear straight through. A strange skill develops over time. You can be shouting into a phone with one ear while simultaneously catching, from 3 desks away, the one crucial number that actually matters. Your brain tunes the roar like a radio dial finding a single frequency inside 1,000 competing stations. It's exhausting. It's also, in its own slightly deranged way, thrilling. Movement never stops. Junior staff sprint between desks clutching slips of paper, as though the fate of nations depends on their speed, which, in the peculiar mythology of this place, it sort of does. Someone leaps onto a chair, waving a phone over his head to be heard above the din. Someone slams a receiver down hard enough to rattle the whole desk, then picks it right back up to dial the next call, because there's never a spare moment to simply sit still and process a feeling. The market doesn't wait for you to catch your breath, and it certainly doesn't wait for you to have an emotional reaction to anything. You drop into your seat, and it practically absorbs you like it's been waiting all night for your return. You grab a phone in one hand before you're even fully seated. Your eyes flick across the terminal, drinking in rows of green numbers, and your other hand is already reaching for a second line. In about 4 seconds flat, you've gone from a man to something closer to machine. One small, furious node plugged into a network of equally furious nodes, all buying and selling and shouting and gambling with sums of money so enormous they've stopped feeling like money at all and started feeling more like points in a very expensive video game. And that really is the quiet secret of the place, the part outsiders never quite grasp. The numbers involved are so large, so detached from anything a person could physically hold, that they lose all human weight. You're not thinking about pensions or savings accounts, or the actual people sitting somewhere on the other end of these trades. You're thinking about winning the next 30 seconds, and then the 30 seconds after that. The roar keeps you from thinking about much else, which is more or less the entire point. You settle the receiver against your shoulder, take one last breath of the hot, electric air, and open your mouth to shout out the first number of your day. Which brings us naturally to the single, most important object in your entire professional existence. The telephone pressed against your ear right now, your beloved, endlessly abused telephone. Your phone is your sword, your shield, and arguably your closest friend, and you will spend the entire day shouting into it. This is an era before computers do any of this work for you, so business gets conducted through sheer vocal force. You cradle the receiver against your shoulder, dial with one hand, and gesture wildly with the other, as if the person on the other end of the line could somehow see how passionately you feel about municipal bonds. You're calling clients. You're calling other traders. You're calling people who very much did not ask to be called. The entire goal is to talk faster than the person on the other end can think. Close the deal before they have time to reconsider, and hang up before they fully register what just happened. Understand that in this world, information doesn't float invisibly through the air waiting to be tapped the way it does today. There's no instant messaging, no email quietly pinging across the globe. There is the phone, and the phone is everything. Every scrap of news, every rumor, every shifting price reaches you through a wire pressed against the side of your head, delivered almost always by a shouting human voice. If you're not on the phone, you are, professionally speaking, nobody. A silent phone on your desk isn't restful, it's terrifying. It means the world is happening somewhere else without you. So you keep that receiver against your ear for hours at a stretch, until it leaves a red mark, and your neck develops a permanent, faintly resigned tilt. The professional posture of a man whose spine gave up fighting the phone years ago. You dial with a blur of fingers, while your other hand slices through the air, jabbing and chopping at nothing in particular, because passion, apparently, needs to be expressed physically, even when the person on the receiving end is a mile away and cannot see a single gesture. It doesn't matter. The gestures are really for you. Conversations themselves are their own strange art form. You don't speak to be understood so much as to overwhelm. The goal is to outrun the other person's caution, to bury their hesitation under an avalanche of confidence and numbers and manufactured urgency, until they agree just to make the noise stop. You praise, you pressure, you flatter, you threaten, sometimes all within a single breath. You promise the window is closing, that everyone else is already in, that only a fool would sit this one out. Whether any of it is strictly true is a philosophical question you simply don't have time to entertain. When a call goes badly, when the person on the other end is being cautious, or clever, or worst of all, silent, you feel real physical discomfort, a hot little itch of frustration. Some of your colleagues handle this by slamming the phone down hard enough to crack the receiver, then immediately dialing someone more agreeable. Equipment takes a beating on this floor. Cords get yanked out of walls. Entire phones occasionally take flight across the room during a particularly operatic tantrum, only to be quietly replaced within the hour. Because a traitor without a phone is a soldier without a weapon. And that simply cannot be allowed to stand around unarmed. By the middle of the day, your throat is raw and your ear has gone numb, and you've spoken to more people than most human beings talk to in an entire month. And you remember almost none of them, because they weren't really people to you. They were voices, opportunities, obstacles, targets. The phone flattens everyone into pure transaction, and honestly, you wouldn't have it any other way. You hang up, flex your aching hand, and turn to shout something at the colleague beside you. And here's where you notice something strange. What comes out of your mouth barely qualifies as English anymore. Every tribe develops its own language, and the 1980s trader speaks a dialect so dense it might as well be a secret code. You don't simply buy things, you take a position. You don't lose money, you experience downside. Everything is leveraged. Everything is a play, and everyone on the floor is either long or short, or getting absolutely crushed. You sprinkle in words like arbitrage and liquidity with the easy confidence of a man who is roughly 70% sure what they actually mean. The jargon does two jobs at once. It makes complicated gambling sound sophisticated, and it keeps outsiders confused enough to hand you their money without asking too many questions. Both functions matter enormously. Listen to yourself for a moment, and it becomes almost funny. You never say you think a stock is going to rise. You say you're long. You never admit you're betting on a fall. You say you're short. You don't have opinions. You have exposure. You don't make mistakes. You take a hit. There's a phrase or a term armor-plated onto nearly every single thing that happens, translating the raw and often faintly humiliating reality of gambling with enormous sums into something that sounds measured, technical, and above all, professional. Some of the language genuinely earns its keep. A precise shorthand between people who need to move fast in a roaring room, where a single crisp word standing in for a complicated idea is worth its weight in gold. But a great deal of it, if you're honest with yourself, which you rarely are, exists purely to sound impressive. Long words for simple ideas. Vaguely Latin-sounding terms attached to what are, underneath it all, fairly basic bets. An entire vocabulary engineered to make a stranger feel that something mysterious and brilliant is unfolding here. Something well beyond their understanding. So they nod politely and stay quiet, which is really the whole point. This is the second, and arguably more important, function of the jargon, and you understand it instinctively, even if you'd never say it out loud. Confusion is profitable. When a client can't quite follow what you're saying, they also can't easily tell whether you're a genius or simply improvising as you go. The fog of specialized language isn't an accident of the trade. It's a service you provide to yourself. It keeps the mystique intact, keeps the fees flowing, keeps everyone nodding along instead of asking the one genuinely dangerous question, which is, what exactly are you doing with my money? And so you fling these words around with total confidence, whether or not you fully grasp them, because hesitation on this floor is a kind of death. A man who pauses to admit uncertainty about a term has already lost the room. So you speak fluently and fast, dropping arbitrage here and liquidity there. And if a flicker of doubt passes behind your eyes, you simply talk louder and faster until it disappears. Everyone around you is doing precisely the same thing. The whole floor becomes a chorus of men speaking a language they only half understand, shouted at full volume. And somehow, most days, it works. Or at least it works, until it very dramatically doesn't. There's a strange comfort buried in it too. The shared vocabulary makes you part of something, a tribe with its own private words and rituals of speech. Meet another man who speaks it fluently, and there's an instant recognition, a lowering of the guard, a sense of us against the confused and moneyed them. Outsiders hear gibberish. You hear home. But even in a room this chaotic, there is order, a strict, almost merciless order. And every single morning, it gets laid out fresh in a ritual that puts everyone firmly back in their place. Before the real bloodshed of the day begins, there's the morning meeting, where the hierarchy of the floor gets restated in plain terms. You file into a room and arrange yourselves according to an invisible but ironclad social code. senior people speak. The junior people nod along. The truly junior people try their best to disappear entirely while frantically scribbling notes. Someone delivers a pep talk that's part motivation, part veiled threat, reminding the room that the market doesn't care about your feelings, and neither does management. You leave that meeting fired up, mildly frightened, and absolutely convinced that today, above all days, you need to produce or perish. The meeting happens early, before the floor has fully woken up, while the coffee hasn't quite finished doing its job. You gather in a large room or crowd loosely around a central figure, and though there are no assigned seats, everyone somehow knows exactly where they belong. The senior men drift naturally into the prime positions, the way water always finds the bottom of a bowl. The mid-level staff hover somewhere in the middle. The junior staff press themselves toward the back and the edges, hopping to observe everything and be noticed by absolutely no one, which is, for a young person in this environment, the safest possible condition. Then the talking starts, and it flows strictly downhill. A senior figure holds the floor, laying out the state of the world as he sees it, which stocks look strong, which look weak, where the opportunities sit, where the dangers lurk. People contribute in careful order of rank. When someone important speaks, the room listens with almost theatrical attention. When a junior person dares to offer an opinion, the temperature in the room noticeably shifts, and they had better be right, brief, and useful, or the silence that follows will teach them a lesson they'll carry for years. Tone of these meetings is a peculiar blend that would baffle any outsider. Half of it is pure motivation, a rousing call to go out there and dominate, to be aggressive, to seize the day and everything attached to it. The other half is naked threat, delivered with a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. You're reminded in various creative ways that the numbers are being watched, that the weak get noticed, that everyone standing in this room is replaceable, and that the replacements are hungry and considerably cheaper. The message underneath every word is simple: perform or be gone. There is no gentle middle ground here, no comfortable coasting. You stand there absorbing it, and something strange happens in your chest, genuine fear, a small cold knot of it, that today you might not measure up. But that fear doesn't weaken you. It sharpens you into something closer to a blade. The whole ritual is engineered to send you out onto the floor slightly desperate, wound tight, with the need to prove yourself all over again, as if yesterday's wins have already evaporated and mean nothing at all, which, in the merciless arithmetic of this place, they very much do. You are only ever as good as today. The hierarchy on display isn't cruelty for its own sake, though it certainly feels that way if you're standing at the back of the room. It's the entire operating system of the place. Everyone knows their exact rank. Everyone can see the rungs above them, and everyone is trained to climb by clawing, producing, and outperforming the person standing next to them. The pecking order isn't a flaw in the design, it is the engine. And this meeting is where it gets refueled every single morning. breaks, and the room empties in a surge of nervous energy. Men peeling off toward their desks with jaws set and pulses quickening, ready to go make money or die trying. And as you move with them, you feel the pull of the one figure looming over the entire room, the man whose approval you crave and whose temper you fear in roughly equal measure. Because standing at the very top of this particular pyramid is your managing director, and no honest account of your day is complete without a proper look at your terrifying, godlike boss. Every floor has one. A managing director rules through some combination of charisma, fear, and an apparently bottomless expense account. This is a person who can end your career with a single raised eyebrow and reward you handsomely on a whim. He has a corner office, a secretary who guards him like a dragon guarding gold, and a temper that arrives without warning, like weather. You want his approval more than you've ever wanted almost anything, which is faintly embarrassing, because somewhere deep down you know that approval is worth exactly as much as your most recent good trade, and not one penny more. The corner office is not merely a room. It's a throne room, positioned so the great man can survey the entire floor through a wall of glass, like a king overlooking his fields. To be summoned into that office is to feel your stomach drop the same way it did as a child walking toward the principal's door. To be praised inside, it produces a high that can last for days. To be scolded inside, it leaves a wound you'll replay for weeks. The entire geography of the floor arranges itself around that one glass box, and everyone, whether they'd admit it or not, spends a portion of every hour wondering exactly what the person inside it thinks of them. Getting past the secretary is its own small trial. She's worked for the great man for years. She knows precisely who matters and who doesn't, and she wields her small kingdom over his calendar with total authority. A warm greeting from her can lift your entire morning. A cool one can quietly ruin it. You are unfailingly, almost pathetically polite to her, because on some animal level you understand she controls access to the sun. The managing director's moods are the weather of your entire professional world, and like weather, they cannot be argued with, only survived. On a good day, he's expansive, generous, even funny, dropping a compliment that makes your chest swell, or authorizing an extravagant expense without blinking. On a bad day, he's a storm front, and the whole floor instinctively lowers its voice, hunches its shoulders, and tries to steer clear of the glass wall entirely. A public dressing down, delivered at full volume in front of the entire floor, is a recognized management technique here. And being on the receiving end of one is a humiliation you would pay almost anything to avoid. And here is the genuinely absurd part, the part you'd never admit out loud. You crave this man's approval with an intensity that would embarrass a teenager. A single nod as he walks past your desk, a muttered good work, and you glow like a lamp for the rest of the day. You'll work yourself sick chasing that feeling, sacrifice sleep, health, relationships, entire chunks of your one short life for the fleeting warmth of a busy man's passing approval. It isn't rational. It's barely dignified. But it is the fuel that runs the entire machine. Because underneath it all, you know exactly how conditional that approval really is. He doesn't love you. He loves what you produce. The warmth is real only for as long as the numbers hold up. And the moment they falter, that corner office turns very cold indeed. You're not really a person to him. You're a line on a report, and the report gets updated daily. You leave his glass box carrying whatever mood he's handed you, and you carry it straight back to your desk. And to keep the numbers looking good, to keep the great man pleased, some of your colleagues reach for a little chemical assistance. Which brings us to the substance that quietly ran an awful lot of the decade. We should address the subject directly, because pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The 1980s on Wall Street ran, in no small part, on cocaine. A substance that convinced an entire generation of financiers they were invincible geniuses, when, in truth, they were mostly just wide awake and talking very fast. It fit the culture with an almost eerie precision. It promised endless energy, unshakable confidence, and no consequences whatsoever, which happens to be more or less the exact pitch these same men used to sell their financial products to clients. The come down, both for the individuals involved and eventually for the decade itself, would turn out to be spectacular. But nobody was thinking about that yet. Nobody had the time. You have to understand why it took hold so completely, because it wasn't an accident of fashion. The job demanded something close to the impossible 20-hour days, sustained sharpness through genuine exhaustion, a feeling of bulletproof confidence, while gambling with sums of money that would keep any reasonable person awake at night out of pure dread. And here was a substance that seemed, at first, to deliver exactly that. It papered over the tiredness. It silenced the doubt. It let a hollow, sleep-starved wreck feel, for an hour or two, like the smartest and most powerful man alive. In a culture that already worshipped that exact feeling, it spread the way fire moves through dry grass. The tragedy, and it genuinely was a tragedy, however much it got dressed up as a party, is that the feeling was a lie. The confidence was chemical, not earned. The energy was borrowed at a punishing rate of interest. Men made worse decisions while feeling more certain about them than ever, which happens to be roughly the most dangerous combination a person handling other people's money can possibly carry around. The very quality the drug seemed to grant, unshakable belief in oneself, was precisely the quality this environment already had in dangerous excess. And the cost arrived the way costs always do, quietly at first, then all at once. It hollowed people out. It wrecked marriages, health, judgment, entire lives. Behind the gleaming suits, the roaring floor, the bottomless bravado, there were men quietly coming apart, running on empty, chasing a feeling that got harder to reach and more expensive to find with every passing month. Nobody discussed it openly. Discussing it would have meant admitting weakness, and weakness was the one unforgivable sin on this floor. So the toll stayed hidden, the party roared on, and the bill kept quietly accumulating in a back room nobody wanted to walk into. There's a grim symmetry to it, easy to spot from a distance, and nearly invisible from inside. The whole decade was, in a sense, running high. Everyone borrowing against a future they assumed would simply arrive on schedule. Everyone convinced the good times had no natural end. Everyone was mistaking a temporary chemical rush, financial or otherwise, for permanent brilliance. What sat on the desk was really just the personal-sized version of what was happening to the entire market. Both promised endless upside. Both ran on borrowed energy. Both were quietly heading toward the same hard landing, and both were absolutely certain it would never come. You watch it happen around you, and maybe, in an environment like this, you get pulled into it too, because saying no, day after day, is its own particular kind of exhausting. And the strangest thing is how ordinary it all feels from the inside. The way anything feels ordinary once everyone around you is doing it. And nobody wants to be the first person to suggest it might be a problem. But the market doesn't care how awake you feel. It only cares about the numbers on the screen. And so you turn, wired and slightly hollow, back to the one machine that never lies to you. The glowing green terminal that is your only real window on the truth. Let's talk about your technology, which felt impossibly futuristic at the time and looks from here, almost charmingly quaint. Your window into the entire financial universe is a bulky beige machine called a Quotron. A screen full of glowing green numbers you stare at with the intensity of a mystic reading tea leaves. There are no sleek laptops here, no smartphones, no apps. There's a heavy terminal, a tangle of cables underneath the desk, and a printer somewhere nearby spitting out a slow ribbon of paper. When the numbers move, you move. When the screen freezes, grown men panic. Your entire empire runs on technology a modern calculator would find almost sweet. The machine sits on your desk like a small humming altar, its screen filled with rows of glowing green figures, prices flickering and updating in a language only the initiated can read at a glance. To you, this jumble of symbols is as clear and legible as a sentence. A stranger looking over your shoulder would see meaningless static. You see the entire mood of the world, the fear and greed of millions of people distilled down into little green digits that twitch, shift, and occasionally, on a dramatic day, seem to scream. You stare at it for hours with an intensity bordering on religious devotion. You don't glance at the screen, you commune with it. Your eyes flick across the numbers, catching a movement here, a shift there, your brain running constant silent arithmetic, while the rest of you sits almost perfectly still. To an outsider, you'd look hypnotized, slumped, half asleep. Inside your skull, an entire storm of calculation is raging. When the numbers move the right way, a jolt of pure joy shoots through you. When they move the wrong way, your stomach lurches like you've missed a step in the dark. It's worth pausing on just how primitive all of this really was, even though it felt like living in the future at the time. There's no mouse to click, no window to open, no interface designed by anyone who particularly cared about your comfort. You type clunky command codes on a heavy keyboard to summon the information you want, memorizing sequences of letters and numbers the way a pianist memorizes scales. The machine runs hot and slow by any modern standard, and it occasionally, catastrophically, freezes. When it freezes, you witness something remarkable. A grown, powerful, extremely well-compensated man reduced instantly to a state of pure childlike panic. The green numbers stop moving. The window to the world slams shut. A trader cut off from his prices is a pilot flying blind through cloud with no instruments, terrified and suddenly completely useless. Voices rise around the floor. The machine gets smacked, as though a firm slap has ever once fixed a piece of electronics in the entire history of electronics. Someone bellows for technical support. For a few unbearable seconds, an entire desk of self-declared masters of the universe are simply anxious men staring at a dead screen, praying quietly to a beige box. Then the numbers flicker back to life. The crisis passes, and everyone pretends they weren't just moments from a full nervous breakdown over a frozen monitor. You exhale, roll your aching shoulders, and dive back into the green glow, your lifeline restored. But even a machine this sacred can't feed you. And by now, your borrowed energy is flagging, and your stomach is staging its own quiet rebellion. It's time for the one ritual of the day devoted entirely to conspicuous, competitive, gloriously wasteful consumption. Lunchtime on Wall Street does not mean a sandwich eaten at your desk. It means a 2-hour campaign of conspicuous spending at a restaurant so expensive the menu doesn't bother listing prices, on the theory that if you have to ask, you shouldn't be sitting there in the first place. You order the steak, you order wine, and then more wine. You put the entire spectacular bill on the company's expense account without a flicker of guilt, because the expense account isn't really money in your mind. It's a magical realm where ordinary consequences simply don't apply. Somewhere out there, a client is being wooed, or a rival is quietly being outspent. Mostly, though, you're just eating like the last emperor of Rome happened to have a 2 o'clock meeting. The restaurant is dim, hushed, paneled in dark wood, dressed in white linen. The waiters move like ghosts, and their prices are a kind of state secret, shared only with a select few. You're given a good table because you're known here, and being given a good table in full view of other diners is a pleasure so pure it nearly justifies the entire career on its own. You settle in, unfold your napkin with a small flourish, and prepare to spend on a single meal an amount of money that would comfortably feed an ordinary family for a month. You order the steak, naturally the largest, best cut on the menu, because lunch here was never really about hunger. It's appetite as performance. You order wine expensive enough to impress your guest, and old enough to have developed opinions of its own. When the bottle runs empty, you order another without a second thought. The food, if you're honest, is genuinely excellent, and you barely taste it. You're too busy talking, watching the room, splitting your attention between the conversation in front of you and the calculation of who just walked in, who they sat down with, and what that might mean for the delicate ecosystem of power you swim through daily. Officially, the purpose of all this is business. There may be a client at the table who needs flattering and softening, wrapped in enough luxury that handing you their money starts to feel like a privilege rather than a risk. Or there may be a rival across the table, quietly competing with you, in which case lunch becomes its own small arms race, each of you ordering more extravagantly than the last, spending the firm's money like rival monarchs trying to outlast one another into submission. The steak is a weapon. The wine is ammunition. And then there's the expense account itself, that glorious institution, that magical realm where the usual rules of money get gently suspended. You don't pay for this. The firm pays for this, which means, in the comforting fiction you've quietly constructed, nobody really pays for it at all. The bill arrives, enormous and utterly unashamed, and you sign it with a lazy flick of the wrist, feeling absolutely nothing, no guilt, no unease, no sense that any of this is real. Money spent on the expense account doesn't feel like money. It feels like weather, like something that simply happens around you. The total detachment from cost is, if you're honest, one of the genuinely great perks of this entire absurd existence. By the time you rise from the table, pleasantly wined and heavily fed, 2 hours have quietly vanished, and a small fortune has been just as quietly incinerated in the name of relationships. You feel expansive, powerful, well upholstered. You stroll back toward the office without any particular hurry, because a man who rushes back from lunch looks anxious, and you are far too important to ever look anxious. And yet, underneath the fine wine and the finer steak, one cold thought keeps ticking away in the background. The single number that all of this feasting, shouting, and gambling is ultimately in service of. So let's finally talk about the thing that quietly owned your soul. Everything, genuinely everything, comes down to this. Your salary is almost an afterthought, a steady trickle you barely register. The real prize arrives once a year, in a single lump sum, and you will treat that one figure as a complete and final verdict on your worth as a human being. You'll obsess over it for months beforehand. You'll compare it secretly and quite desperately to what you believe your colleagues received. A bonus that would change most families' lives forever can send you spiraling into rage and despair. If the man 2 desks over got even slightly more than you did. By this point, this has nothing to do with survival. It stopped being about survival a long time ago. This is purely about the scoreboard. You have to understand how the money is structured, because it explains almost everything about how you behave the rest of the year. Your salary, steady, predictable, unremarkable, is beneath your notice. The real money, the life-altering money, arrives once annually, and its size depends entirely on how you performed, how the firm did overall, and crucially, on the private judgment of powerful men deciding these things behind closed doors. This means that for 11 months out of 12, you are effectively auditioning. Every trade, every deal quietly logged in some invisible ledger that will eventually get converted into a single, all-important figure. And when that figure finally arrives, you don't experience it as a payment. You experience it as a judgment. It is your grade. It is the firm telling you, in the only language you truly respect, exactly what it believes you are worth. A large number isn't just money, it's validation, love, proof, vindication. A disappointing number isn't just less money. It's a slap, an insult, a statement that you are less than you believed yourself to be. Men have wept over bonus figures most of humanity would consider a lottery win. Men have quit in fury over sums that could buy a house outright, because here is the poison sitting at the very center of it, the thing that turns extraordinary fortune into genuine misery. It is never, ever about the absolute amount. It is always, always about the comparison. You don't ask whether your bonus is enormous, whether it exceeds what your parents earned across their entire working lives, whether it's more than any reasonable person could ever spend. You ask only one question: did the man 2 desks over get more? And if he did, even slightly, your enormous, life-altering, genuinely absurd bonus curdles instantly into an insult. And you sit there stewing in rage over a fortune poisoned by a comparison you were never even meant to know about. This is the engine driving the entire machine, and it's a cruel, almost brilliant piece of design. By tying your sense of self-worth to a single number, and then setting that number in silent competition against everyone around you, the firm guarantees you will never, ever feel satisfied. There is no amount that would be enough, because enough was never really a number to begin with. It's a feeling. And the comparison guarantees you will never actually reach it. You will chase the next bonus, and the one after that forever, always convinced that just a little more would finally settle the ache. It never does. You catch yourself doing the math, even now, mid-year, trying to guess the number, trying to read the mood of the powerful men who will decide it. And you feel that familiar hunger tighten in your gut, a hunger no meal can touch. And to feed it, to justify the number you're already dreaming about, you need deals. Big ones. Spectacular ones. Which is exactly why the whole industry fell so completely in love with a dazzling new financial invention that, for a few glorious years, seemed to conjure enormous sums of money out of thin air. We arrive now at one of the era's defining financial inventions, the junk bond, which is exactly what it sounds like, dressed up in a very nice suit. The idea, championed most famously out of an office on the West Coast by a financier who briefly seemed to have rewritten the fundamental rules of money itself, was deceptively simple and enormously seductive. You could raise vast piles of cash by selling risky, high-interest debt, and use that cash to do things that had previously been unthinkable. It made the impossible suddenly possible, and it made an awful lot of people obscenely rich. It also, quietly, planted a time bomb underneath the whole system, ticking away beneath the champagne. But that was a worry reserved strictly for future you. Let's break the trick down, because underneath the intimidating name, it's really fairly simple. A bond is just a loan. When a company wants money, it can borrow by issuing bonds, promising to repay later with interest. Traditionally, only large, safe, boring companies could do this easily, because lenders wanted real assurance they'd get paid back. Riskier, smaller companies were mostly locked out, considered too dangerous to lend to at all. Any bonds they did manage to issue were sneeringly labeled junk, and the name stuck. Then came the insight that lit the fuse. Yes, these riskier bonds were genuinely more likely to default. But if you charged a high enough interest rate to compensate for that risk, and spread your bets across many of them at once, the math could actually work out beautifully. Suddenly, junk wasn't garbage, it was opportunity. All that risky, previously untouchable debt became a vast new ocean of available money. And the man who understood this best became, for a time, one of the most powerful figures in all of finance, conducting the whole symphony not from the canyons of downtown Manhattan, but from an office out west. What made it so intoxicating was what all that new money could actually do. With access to these enormous new pools of cash, smaller players could suddenly act like giants. A modestly sized company, or even an ambitious individual with the right pitch, could raise sums of money previously reserved for only the very largest institutions on earth. The old hierarchy, where serious capital belonged exclusively to the established and the enormous, was suddenly blown wide open. Anybody with a bold plan and a persuasive enough pitch could borrow a fortune and go hunting. It felt, to the people riding the wave, like democracy. It felt like genius. It felt, in the moment, like they'd discovered an actual new law of financial physics. And for a while, it worked spectacularly. Fortunes were made. Deals that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier were suddenly happening every single week. The men at the center of it grew rich beyond imagining, celebrated as visionaries and revolutionaries, as the smartest people in a very smart room. Champagne flowed, fees poured in, and everyone congratulated themselves on being clever enough to have spotted what the stuffy old guard had somehow missed. But there was a shadow underneath all of it, and a few quiet voices tried to point it out and were largely ignored. All this borrowing rested on one enormous assumption: that the good times would simply continue, that the risky companies would keep paying, that the music would never stop. Debt is a wonderful servant and a terrible master, and the entire glittering structure was built on a genuine mountain of it. Nobody wanted to think too hard about what might happen if that mountain ever started to slide. That was a problem for later, and later was a place these men had learned not to visit. For now, the junk bond machine roared on, and it was hungry, and it needed things to buy. And what it bought most dramatically of all were entire companies, swallowed whole in a maneuver that became the signature move of the entire decade. Let's talk about the leveraged buyout, the decade's favorite piece of financial sleight of hand, which worked a little like buying a house, using a loan secured against the very house you hadn't bought yet. Corporate raiders would target a company, borrow staggering sums of money, purchase it outright, and often carve it into pieces and sell off the parts. To the winners, this looked like genius, pure financial creativity. To the thousands of employees who lost their jobs when the company they'd given years of their lives to got dismantled for profit, it felt like something else entirely. But you're standing on the floor watching a deal like this come together, and all you can really see are the fees. The beautiful, beautiful fees. Here's how the trick actually works. And it really is a dazzling piece of engineering once you see its shape. A raider identifies a company he believes is worth more than its current price suggests. Often a sleepy, undervalued firm sitting on valuable assets nobody's paying attention to. He doesn't use his own money to buy it, because that would be enormous and risky. Instead, he borrows the vast majority of the purchase price. And here's the clever, almost impudent part. He borrows it against the very company he's about to buy. The target company's own assets and future earnings become the collateral securing the loan used to purchase it. The company, in effect, funds its own conquest. Once the raider owns it, the company now carries a mountain of debt it never had before, debt taken on purely to buy itself. And that debt has to be serviced, which means cash has to be found fast. So the new owner starts hunting for money inside his own prize. He sells off divisions. He closes factories. He cuts costs down to the bone. Sometimes he breaks the entire company into pieces and sells them off separately. Discovering the parts are worth more individually than the whole ever was, and pocketing the difference as pure profit. A company that had existed for generations could be bought, gutted, and dismantled inside a matter of months. To the men doing it, and to you watching from the floor, this looked like brilliance, like unlocking hidden value, like a bold, clever improvement on a lazy old system. Underperforming companies were being shaken awake. Waste was being trimmed. Assets were being put to better use. That was the official story, told with total conviction, and parts of it were even true. Some of these companies genuinely had been poorly managed. Some of the shakeups genuinely did create real value. But there was another side to it, easy to ignore from behind a trading desk, and impossible to ignore if you happened to work at one of the targeted firms. Behind the elegant financial maneuvering were real people, thousands of them, whose jobs vanished the moment a division was sold or a factory closed to help service debt they had absolutely no say in taking on. Entire communities that had depended on a long-standing employer could be quietly hollowed out in a single quarter. To the raider, it was a spreadsheet being optimized. To the family whose livelihood disappeared, it was a catastrophe that arrived without warning in the mail. And you, watching the buyout come together from the floor, feel almost nothing about any of that, because your attention is entirely captured by one thing: the fees, the bonus, the scoreboard, and how magnificent this particular deal is about to look on all three. The trouble, of course, is that not every clever way to make money on this floor was strictly legal. And the line between a brilliant edge and a federal crime turned out to be considerably blurrier than anyone wanted to admit out loud. Now we tiptoe into more dangerous territory, the gray zone where a good tip and a federal crime start to look confusingly similar. In a world built entirely on information, the temptation to trade on secrets you weren't supposed to have was enormous, and plenty of people didn't resist it. A whisper at the right dinner, a leaked document, a friend with early knowledge of a deal before it went public. It felt harmless. It felt clever. It felt, to the people doing it, like simply how the game was actually played. It was also, in the plainest possible terms, against the law. And by the middle of the decade, the people whose job it was to notice these things had started, very quietly, to notice. The logic of the temptation is easy to follow, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. Your entire profession is built around pursuing an edge, knowing something slightly sooner or slightly better than the next person. That's what you do all day, legally and honorably, chasing scraps of insight through phone calls and research and instinct. So when a genuinely valuable secret drifts into your hands, information that hasn't yet reached the public, information that could let you make a fortune with essentially no risk, it doesn't register as a bright red line. It feels like the same familiar game, just easier. It feels like winning. And these secrets were everywhere, because a major deal can't be assembled in complete silence. Lawyers know, bankers know, the people who typeset and print the documents know. Somewhere along that chain, well before a merger or a buyout gets announced to the world, dozens of people already know it's coming, and every single one of them is sitting on knowledge worth an enormous amount of money to anyone willing to act on it early. A quiet word passed at a dinner party, a favor traded between old friends, a document that lingers a moment too long on the wrong desk. The information leaks, and the temptation follows it everywhere it travels, trading on that knowledge felt, to the people doing it, almost victimless. A clever use of good connections rather than an actual crime. They told themselves everyone did it, that it was simply how the smart money operated, that the rules were designed for the slow and the timid. They convinced themselves the risk was minimal, that they were far too careful, far too clever to ever get caught. The same intoxicating confidence running through everything else in this world whispered that consequences were reserved strictly for other people. But it was illegal, plainly and simply, and the people whose job it was to police it were neither as slow nor as foolish as the traders liked to assume. Quietly, patiently, they had already begun building cases, following the money, mapping the connections, noting the suspiciously well-timed trades clustering like flies around every major announcement. These investigators worked out of far less glamorous offices, on salaries you'd have found almost insulting, without the cars, or the suits, or the swagger. From the height of your winning streak, they looked slow, outmatched by the speed and sophistication and sheer wealth of the world they were supposedly policing. And most of you genuinely believed they'd never catch up, that they simply didn't understand the game well enough to lay a finger on the people actually playing it. This turned out to be a serious mistake, because the investigators had something the traders had long since lost: patience. And patience, in this context, is a quiet and genuinely terrible weapon. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to win every single day the way you did. They needed only to be right once, at the very end. And they were perfectly content to spend years working toward that one moment, following the money, mapping every connection, quietly gathering the evidence that the confident and the careless kept scattering everywhere behind them. While you were chasing the next 30 seconds, they were building something that would take years to finish and would not simply forget. And the evidence, it turned out, was everywhere, because a world built on constant talking leaves tracks. Paper trails survive long after the men who created them have forgotten they ever existed. Trade records sit patiently in files, waiting. And when investigators eventually gained the ability to record conversations as they happened, the entire game changed, because chatter that felt so private in the moment became, later, a permanent and damning record. The very habits that built these fortunes, the constant talking, the whispered tips, the deals struck over dinner, became the threads investigators could pull. Then came the pressure. And pressure has a way of turning a tight, loyal circle into a chain of falling dominoes. Once investigators finally caught someone holding enough evidence, they offered a choice: cooperate, or face the full weight of the consequences entirely alone. Person after person, faced with that choice, chose to talk, to name others, to trade their friends for a lighter sentence of their own. The loyalty that had seemed so solid at the height of the party proved remarkably thin the moment handcuffs entered the room. One name led to another, and then another, each cooperating witness widening the net a little further. And so, as the decade wore on toward its later years, the unthinkable began happening. Some of the biggest names in the entire industry, men celebrated as visionaries on magazine covers, were marched out of their own offices in handcuffs, in full view of the very cameras that had once celebrated them. The images landed as devastating precisely because they were so public. The master of the universe reduced to a defendant. The swagger gone. The expensive suit suddenly looking like nothing more than a costume. The party, it turned out, had always had a guest list, and someone had been quietly checking it the entire time. Now the checking was finished, but even as individual handcuffs closed, a far larger reckoning was already gathering elsewhere. One no cooperation deal could soften and no clever lawyer could argue away, because it was coming for everyone at once, on a single catastrophic day. We'll get to that day very soon. But first, let's spare a thought for the people at the very bottom of this glittering food chain, because not everyone on this floor was living the version of the story we've been describing so far. Spare a thought now for the junior analyst, the freshly graduated young person sitting at the absolute bottom rung of the ladder. If that's you, your life isn't really a life. It's an endurance experiment. You work 20-hour days. You occasionally sleep under your own desk. You fetch coffee, build spreadsheets entirely by hand, and absorb abuse from every direction as though it were simply part of your compensation package. Which, in a sense, it is. You're paid well by the standards of a 22-year-old, and treated worse than the office plants. You tell yourself this is temporary, a rite of passage, and that one day you'll be the one throwing the stapler instead of ducking one. That thought alone is what keeps you upright. The hours would break most people, and honestly, they're meant to. You arrive before sunrise and leave long after dark, and on the worst nights, you don't leave at all, folding yourself under your desk for a few hours of gray, uncomfortable sleep before the whole cycle begins again. Time stops meaning much. The days blur into a single endless shift, punctuated occasionally by moments of pure panic. You forget what a weekend feels like. Your friends outside this world eventually stop inviting you to things because you never show up. And eventually, you stop even noticing that they've stopped asking. The work itself swings wildly between crushing tedium and outright terror. Much of it is grinding, repetitive drudgery, assembling numbers by hand, checking figures, building the enormous documents that senior people will later present and take full credit for. Remember, this is an age before a computer does any of this at the press of a button. It's done by hand, late at night by you. And a single buried error on page 40 of some document can bring a senior person's fury crashing down on your head like a collapsing building. So you check and recheck and check again, hollow-eyed, genuinely terrified of the mistake that ends up with your name attached to it. And then there's the abuse, which is simply understood to be part of the arrangement. You get shouted at. You get belittled. You're handed impossible tasks on impossible deadlines, and blamed the moment the impossibility asserts itself. Your ideas are ignored. Your presence is barely acknowledged, and you're expected to absorb every bit of it with a grateful smile, because there are 100 other hungry graduates who would take your desk in a heartbeat. The mistreatment isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system, a deliberate filter designed to sort out who will break and who will simply take it and keep going. The strangest part, the part that would baffle any sensible outside observer, is that you actually want this. You fought for it. You beat out dozens of other bright young people for the sheer privilege of being treated like this. And you'd fight to keep it, because just above you, you can see the rungs of the ladder, and you can see exactly where they lead, to the corner office, the enormous bonus, the kind of power you crave. The suffering is an investment, or so you tell yourself at 3 in the morning, folded under your desk. Pay now, collect later. So you endure. You fetch the coffee, you build the spreadsheets, you swallow the insults, and you cling to the promise, mostly true, occasionally not, that this is temporary, that the worm eventually turns, that one day you'll stand at the top of this exact pyramid and hand down the very same treatment to some fresh-eyed graduate of your own. It isn't a noble dream, but at the bottom of the ladder, it's the only warmth available. Of course, this brutal ladder was never open to everyone equally. In fact, the whole gleaming structure functioned as a very exclusive club, with a door that stayed firmly shut to most of the human race. Look around the floor, and the sameness becomes almost comical once you actually notice it. Row after row of men dressed alike, speaking alike, drawn from the same handful of schools and the same handful of backgrounds, all sharing the same unshakable belief in their own rightful place there. Nobody questioned the uniformity, because to the men living inside it, it didn't look like uniformity at all. It just looked like what a serious person was naturally supposed to be. Anyone who looked or sounded even slightly different was, by that unspoken logic, automatically a little suspicious. A problem to be quietly explained, rather than a colleague to simply be welcomed. For the women who did force their way in, and some absolutely did, through sheer brilliance and a tolerance for nonsense that would humble a saint. The daily experience was a continuous, low-grade siege. Their ideas got interpreted more slowly and credited less. Their presence in a meeting was treated as something requiring justification. They were spoken over, talked down to, and subjected to a running commentary on their appearance and manner that no man in the room ever had to endure. Behavior that would empty an office of its entire senior staff by lunchtime today was, then, simply the weather they were expected to work through without complaint, while also somehow outperforming everyone else just to be considered adequate. The exclusion extended well past the trading floor itself, into all the places where the real relationships actually got built, which made it especially effective. So much of the important networking happened in spaces designed entirely around men, the late-night dinners, the clubby after-hours haunts, 100 small social rituals from which outsiders were quietly and completely absent. You could be brilliant, hardworking, and relentless, and still find yourself locked out of the rooms where careers were actually decided, not by any written rule, but by a soft, total, deniable understanding of who belonged and who simply didn't. And the men inside justified it, when they bothered to justify it at all, with the laziest argument imaginable. This was simply how things had always been. Tradition, the way of the place. It had worked so far, hadn't it? And just look how rich everyone had gotten, that the tradition might be excluding enormous amounts of genuine talent, that the club might actually be weaker for its own narrowness, never seriously occurred to anyone, because the club had been designed precisely to prevent that particular thought from ever needing to surface. The waste of it is the part that lingers longest. All that ability turned away at the door. All those sharp minds sent elsewhere, or worn down, or simply never given a real chance, in the name of keeping a comfortable room comfortable for the men already occupying it. The club congratulated itself endlessly on being the best of the best, all while quietly ensuring it would only ever be the best of a very small and very familiar few. And it never once suspected it was cheating itself in the process. The men inside, of course, felt no shortage at all. They felt like winners, and winners in this particular world proved it by surrounding themselves with expensive, beautiful objects. Which brings us to the watches, the cars, and the whole glittering collection of status symbols. A self-respecting master of the universe simply couldn't do without. Let's talk about the toys, because money that can't be seen is, to this crowd, money that barely counts as real. Every single purchase functions as a message. The watch has to be a specific, knowing brand that other insiders will instantly recognize and civilians never will. The car has to be a European sports machine, ideally red, ideally impractical, ideally driven at reckless speed toward a summer house you'll visit maybe twice a year. Everything you own gets chosen not for how it makes you feel, but for how it makes other bankers feel, which is to say, slightly worse about themselves. It's exhausting, it's expensive, and it is, quite genuinely, the entire point. Start with the watch, because it's the purest example of the whole strange philosophy in miniature. You don't buy a watch to tell the time. You have 100 easier ways to do that. You buy a watch to send a signal, and the very best signals are the quiet ones, the kind only the initiated know how to read. A truly knowing timepiece doesn't shout its price at strangers passing by. It murmurs it softly to the tiny handful of people who understand exactly what it is and exactly what it cost. A secret handshake worn on the wrist. The real satisfaction isn't in the object itself. It's in the flicker of recognition on a rival's face when he clocks it. Then there's the car, a considerably louder instrument entirely. A gleaming, low-slung European sports machine, thoroughly unsuited to the actual conditions of a crowded city, isn't really transportation at all. It's a statement fired at full volume. It doesn't matter that you sit in the exact same traffic as everyone else, that the thing is impractical and temperamental, and spends most of its life parked at the curb. What matters is the arrival, the moment you pull up, step out, and let the machine do the talking for you. You drive it recklessly out to the summer house you barely visit, because the point of the summer house, much like the point of the car, was never really to use it. It was to have it, and to be known to have it. And this is the thread running through nearly all of it, the logic that gives the entire spending spree a kind of demented internal sense. Nothing you buy is really for you. The pleasure isn't in the driving, or the wearing, or the actual living. The pleasure sits entirely in the effect the object has on other people, specifically on other men exactly like you. You're not building a life. You're assembling evidence, exhibit after gleaming exhibit, in an endless trial where the only verdict that matters is whether the other bankers are sufficiently impressed, which means, of course, that you can never actually win because the game has no finish line. There's always a better watch, a faster car, a bigger house, a more exclusive version of whatever you just bought to feel superior for an afternoon. The moment you acquire the thing you wanted, it stops feeling impressive and simply becomes normal, and your eye drifts immediately toward the next rung up. The satisfaction evaporates on contact. You're running on a treadmill built entirely of objects, faster and faster, and the finish line moves exactly as quickly as you do. It would be exhausting if you ever stopped long enough to actually feel it, which you rarely do. All that money, all that striving, converted into a pile of beautiful things that bring you no lasting joy whatsoever, chosen entirely to needle people you don't even particularly like. But you don't stop to feel any of that. You check your watch, the knowing one, feel the small, warm hit of superiority, and it's enough to keep you buying. And of all the trophies a man in your position can accumulate, none is more public, more scrutinized, or more brutally competitive than the place he chooses to hang his hat, which turns out to be a battle entirely its own. Now let's talk about real estate, because where you live isn't a home in any ordinary sense. It's a public scorecard with a doorman standing in front of it. The goal is an apartment in exactly the right building, on exactly the right block, with a view that announces you've arrived. Getting past the notoriously particular co-op boards guarding these buildings is its own blood sport, a genuinely humiliating audition in which extremely wealthy people get judged by even wealthier people and are frequently found wanting. Once you're inside, you'll hire a decorator to fill the place with expensive things, and then spend almost no time there because you're always at the office, but it will look magnificent during the 6 minutes a week you're actually home to see it. The address itself carries meaning as precise as a rank stitched onto a uniform. Certain buildings on certain streets in certain neighborhoods announce that you've arrived at a specific altitude of success, and everyone in your world can read those coordinates instantly, at a glance. To live at the wrong address, even a perfectly comfortable one, is to be quietly filed away as someone still climbing. To live at the right one is to be waved through socially without a single further question asked. So you don't simply look for somewhere pleasant to live. You hunt for a precise set of coordinates, a trophy with a front entrance, and a doorman who will eventually learn to greet your guests by name before they've even introduced themselves. But the right buildings don't simply let you in because you happen to have the money. And this is the part that drives men exactly like you to a quiet, simmering fury. Many of the most desirable buildings are governed by boards made up of existing residents, and these boards decide, entirely on their own terms, who may buy in and who may not. To be permitted to hand over your enormous fortune, you first have to submit to an audition. presenting your finances, your references, and yourself for the judgment of a panel of people who already live there and who seem to enjoy nothing more than deciding you're not quite their sort. It is a genuinely humbling ritual, and one of the very few in your entire life where your money doesn't automatically win the day. You, a self-declared master of the universe, a man accustomed to being feared and flattered in roughly equal measure, must sit in a room and be evaluated like a nervous job applicant by a committee of retirees and heiresses who could reject you on a whim and never bother explaining why. The powerlessness of it is maddening, and the fact that they're often even richer and more established than you, and therefore genuinely unimpressed by everything you've built your entire identity around, is the sharpest cut of all. If you clear that hurdle, the real spending begins, because an empty trophy is no trophy at all. You hire a decorator, because choosing your own furnishings would be both time-consuming and dangerously revealing of your actual taste, and you hand them a budget that would make most people faint. They fill the apartment with expensive art, expensive furniture, expensive everything, assembling a kind of stage set of success, calibrated precisely to impress the specific people you intend to eventually invite over. Your home becomes a showroom, beautiful, expensive, and not really yours at all, curated entirely for an audience. And then comes the final absurdity. You almost never actually live in it. You're at the office before dawn, home long after dark, and the magnificent apartment sits empty and gleaming, admired mostly by the cleaning staff who tend to it far more consistently than you do. You experience your own home in brief, exhausted glimpses, a few minutes here and there, a place to change your suit and collapse. You spent a fortune and endured a genuine humiliation to acquire a trophy you barely have time to look at. But it photographs beautifully, and on the rare evening you actually host something there, it does its job flawlessly. And that, you tell yourself, is what it was always for. Furnishing that trophy is only one branch of a much larger compulsion, though a restless need to acquire that follows you well beyond your own front door and into every shop willing to have you. Let's go shopping, because for a certain kind of 1980s banker, spending money was less a pleasure and more a compulsion, something close to breathing, except it comes with a receipt. You buy suits you don't need, shirts by the dozen, shoes that gleam under any light you put them near. The store clerks know you by name and greet you like visiting royalty, which you find entirely appropriate. The purchases pile up in your closet, tags sometimes still attached, because the actual acquiring was never really the point. The point was always the feeling, that brief, warm hit of importance that comes from handing over a card and watching someone else scramble to please you. And the feeling never lasts long, so you go back and do it all over again. The scale of it makes no rational sense whatsoever, and rational sense was never really the point. You already own more suits than there are working days in your week, and yet you keep buying more, because the buying was never about need. You own shirts by the dozen, still crisp inside their packaging, some of which you'll never actually wear before they go out of style, or you simply forget they exist entirely. Your shoes line up in rows like a small, gleaming parade. By any sane measure, you have vastly more than you could ever use, and the acquiring continues anyway, steady and compulsive. A habit that's quietly detached itself from any real purpose. Part of the pleasure lies in the treatment, and the treatment is genuinely intoxicating. In the right shops, you aren't a customer, you're royalty. The clerks know your name, your sizes, your preferences, and they greet you with a warmth and deference that soothes something raw underneath the surface. They bring you things. They fuss over you. They make you feel, for the length of the visit, like the single most important person in the world, and you accept this as entirely your due, in a life spent mostly being shouted at, and anxiously measuring yourself against rivals. The shop is a rare place where you're simply adored, and you go back precisely to be adored again. But underneath, the ritual sits the real engine, which is the transaction itself, the specific moment of paying. When you hand over the card and watch the staff spring into motion on your behalf, wrapping and boxing, and thanking you profusely, you feel a brief, warm surge of power and importance, a little hit of pure significance. For a few seconds, you are unmistakably a man of consequence, and the feeling is genuinely lovely. And it is also chemical and fleeting, gone almost as soon as it arrives. The goods themselves are almost beside the point. It was always the moment you were really buying, and because the feeling fades so quickly, you need it again. So the cycle turns. You buy, you glow briefly, you fade, you buy again. The purchases accumulate in your closet, some with the tags still attached, small monuments to a hunger that no amount of merchandise could ever actually fill. If you ever stop to look at that closet honestly, at the sheer unworn abundance of it, you might feel a small chill of recognition, might glimpse the compulsion for exactly what it is. But you don't stop to look. You're already thinking about the next thing. It's the same restless emptiness driving everything else in your life. The bonus, the trophies, the endless comparison, simply pointed, for the moment, at a rack of shirts. More never becomes enough, because enough was never really the target. The chase was the target, and the chase, by design, has no finish line. The one place you might expect this crowd to seek something genuinely real, rather than another purchase, is in the care of their own bodies. But even that, it turns out, became just another performance. We should talk about the physical maintenance of the 1980s financier, which was its own strange contradiction. On one hand, there was a growing obsession with fitness, sharp jawlines, competitive squash games, being seen at exactly the right gym. On the other hand, this was a person surviving on black coffee, adrenaline, extravagant dinners, and substances actively working to shorten his life. The result was a body pushed to its absolute limits, and then asked, somehow, to look flawless in a suit. Stress was a constant companion, ignored right up until it announced itself, sometimes quite dramatically. But worrying about your own health felt like something that happened to other, weaker people. You had a meeting. The fitness obsession was real. And like everything else in your life, it was as much about display as it was about actual health. Being lean and sharp-jawed and visibly disciplined signaled that you had your appetites firmly under control, that you were a winner in the body as well as the bank account. So you played squash, aggressively and competitively, treating a friendly weeknight game as just another arena to dominate. You appeared at exactly the right health club, where being seen mattered nearly as much as anything you actually did once you got there. A fit body was a kind of resume worn underneath the expensive suit, proof of the same relentless drive that made you all that money in the first place. But the contradiction underneath, it was almost comical, and it wasn't funny at all. This carefully maintained body was simultaneously being quietly poisoned by nearly everything else in your daily life. You ran on coffee and adrenaline and very little actual sleep. You ate enormous, rich dinners late into the night, fueled your days with substances quietly attacking your heart, and marinated the whole operation in a constant bath of stress. You were building the machine up in the gym each morning and tearing it back down everywhere else for the rest of the day. And the two efforts roughly canceled each other out, leaving you looking sharp on the surface and quietly fraying underneath. Stress was the constant, uninvited companion, and you trained yourself to ignore it with a thoroughness that would eventually present its own bill. The clenched jaw, the racing heart, the tight chest, the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, running numbers over and over. All of it was simply the texture of the job, the price of admission, nothing worth making a fuss about. To acknowledge that the stress was genuinely hurting, you would have meant admitting weakness. And weakness was the one thing you could never afford to show. So you pressed the feeling down and kept moving, telling yourself you'd deal with it later, at some vague point when things finally calmed down. Things never calmed down, and so the warnings, when they eventually came, tended to arrive suddenly and dramatically, because you'd ignored every quiet one along the way. Men in their absolute prime, gleaming with success and squash court fitness, would find their bodies abruptly presenting the accumulated invoice for years of abuse and denial. The heart, in particular, keeps a very accurate ledger, and it doesn't care how good you look in a suit or how large your last bonus happened to be. It only cares about the coffee and the powder and the stress and the sleepless nights. And eventually, some of the time, it spoke up in the one language that finally could not be ignored. But that felt, for now, like something that happened to other men, weaker men who couldn't handle the pace. You had a meeting. You always had a meeting. And the meeting felt more real and more urgent than any distant worry about a body you were confident would simply keep performing, because it always had before. The stress needed release somewhere, though, and when the closing bell finally freed you from the floor each afternoon. That release got pursued with exactly the same aggression you brought to everything else. The market closes, but for this crowd, the day is nowhere near finished. The evening is simply the second shift of showing off. You spill out into the bars of the financial district, loud and triumphant, or loud and furious, depending entirely on how the trading day went, but always loud. Drinks arrive by the tray. Deals get relived, exaggerated, and reenacted with sweeping hand gestures. The bar fills with people exactly like you, all decompressing from a day of pure aggression by simply being aggressive somewhere else. It isn't relaxation, not really. It's the same performance, just with a cocktail in your hand and your tie loosened half an inch. The closing bell doesn't switch you off. It simply redirects you. All that energy, the ambition, the restless need to win, doesn't evaporate just because the market has shut for the day. It pours out of the building along with you and floods straight into the bars, looking for somewhere new to go. You arrive still vibrating from the day, and whether you're celebrating a triumph or nursing a loss, the volume in your voice is identical, because the point was never really the mood. The point is the noise, the presence, the sheer taking up of space. The drinking gets done with the same excess as everything else in your life. Nobody sips. Drinks arrive by the tray, bought in grand rounds by men eager to prove that money means absolutely nothing to them, that they could incinerate an entire evening's wages on cocktails without so much as a flicker. The generosity is real, and it's also thoroughly competitive, each round its own small flex. Each bought drink a quiet way of saying you can afford not to care. The alcohol layers itself over whatever chemistry is already coursing through the crowd, and the whole room tilts steadily toward louder, bolder, and considerably less wise. The talk endlessly is of the day itself, the deals, the trades, the near misses, relived and reshaped with every retelling. A modest win becomes a triumph. A lucky escape becomes a display of pure genius. Hands slice through the air, reenacting the crucial moment, the bold call, the killer instinct. And everyone is the hero of their own story. And everyone politely lets everyone else be the hero of theirs. Because tomorrow, they'll want that same courtesy returned. The bar functions as a small factory for legends, most of them lightly fictional, all of them flattering. Look around, and the crowd is entirely made up of people exactly like you, which is precisely the appeal and precisely the problem. This isn't a mix of different lives unwinding together. It's a single type of person multiplied. All of you fresh from the same battlefield, all of you decompressing from a day of aggression by simply being aggressive somewhere else. You didn't leave the competition back at the office. You brought it with you and set it up at the bar, keeping score now with drinks and stories and sheer volume instead of trades, which is exactly why it isn't really rest. However much it might look like a party from across the room, genuine rest would require letting the performance drop, and the performance never quite drops. You loosen your tie, yes, and you laugh. And to a passing stranger, it might look like release. But underneath, the same engine keeps running. The same need to impress, to dominate, to be seen winning. You're still working, really, just with a drink in your hand, and you'll keep at it until late, and then get up in a few short hours and do it all again. And on certain nights, when the occasion truly demands real display, the bar is only the warm-up, and the evening moves further on toward a place where being seen becomes the entire point of the exercise. Let's talk about dinner, which isn't about food and is entirely about visibility. There's a small, fiercely guarded set of restaurants where the powerful eat, and simply securing a table at one of them functions as a public statement about your standing. You know the maitre d' by name, or you desperately pretend to. You're seated, ideally, somewhere prominent, so that everyone entering can register your presence and quietly adjust their opinion of you accordingly. The food is genuinely excellent and almost entirely beside the point. What matters is the theater of it. The nods exchanged across the room, the sense that you're dining at the very center of the universe, which, for one more glittering evening, you genuinely believe you are. Tables here are scarce, coveted, and handed out according to a hierarchy, every bit as strict as the one running the trading floor. To secure a good one on short notice, on a good night, is to prove you matter, that the machinery of exclusivity has recognized you and bent just slightly in your favor. The reservation itself is the first course, and it's the one you savor the most. Your relationship with the maitre d' is therefore a matter of genuine importance and genuine anxiety. To be greeted by name and led without any fuss to a fine table is a small public coronation, witnessed by the entire room. So you cultivate that relationship with charm, generous tips, and the occasional favor. And if you haven't quite earned it yet, you fake the familiarity and hope he plays along. There are few things in your world more quietly devastating than approaching that podium and receiving a blank, unhurried look in return, where your seated matters almost as much as whether you're seated at all. The prize tables are the visible ones, the ones from which you can see and, crucially, be seen. To be placed prominently is to be put on display for every important person who walks through the door, each of whom registers your presence, notes your company, and quietly recalibrates their sense of where you stand. To be tucked into a corner or seated near the kitchen is a subtle humiliation, a message that tonight, at least, you're not among the people who most need to be seen. You'd rather wait an hour for a good table than take a bad one immediately. The food, meanwhile, is superb, and you barely register it. The kitchen is genuinely brilliant, the ingredients rare, the preparation flawless, and none of that is really why you're there. You're there for the theater, the exchange of nods across the room, the small diplomatic signals of recognition passing between the powerful over plates they've barely touched. A meal here is a performance staged for an audience of peers and rivals, and the actual eating is almost an inconvenience, something to be done between between the more important business of being observed doing it, and in the warm candlelight, surrounded by the powerful, greeted by name, seated in full view of the room, you feel it settle over you again. That intoxicating conviction that you're at the very center of the world, that this room is where reality itself gets decided, that you're one of the people who matter most in the most important city on earth. For one more glittering evening, you believe it completely. That belief, repeated night after night, hardens over time into something bigger and stranger than simple confidence. A worldview so grand and so fragile it genuinely deserves a name of its own. We arrive now at the mindset itself, the towering, almost cosmic self-regard that defined the entire breed. These men didn't think of themselves as merely rich or merely successful. They thought of themselves as a kind of new aristocracy, the smartest and most important people alive, entitled to their fortunes by sheer superiority. Consequences were for other people. Rules were suggestions meant for the timid. The ordinary population existed somewhere far below, a blur of lesser lives that didn't understand the game. It was an intoxicating way to see yourself, and a deeply fragile one, because a worldview built entirely on winning has only one direction it can travel once the winning stops. This self-regard went far beyond ordinary confidence, the kind every successful person naturally carries. This was something grander and stranger, a genuine belief that you and your kind constituted a new breed of aristocracy, elevated above the common run of humanity, not by an accident of birth, but by sheer merit, intelligence, and nerve. You had won, therefore you were superior, and your superiority in turn justified the winning. A perfect, closed loop of self-flattery that admitted no doubt and required no evidence beyond the size of your own rewards. From inside that loop, the rest of the world looked very small indeed. Ordinary people, the ones riding the trains, working regular jobs, never quite understanding the game, existed somewhere far below you. A faceless blur, an audience, a backdrop, occasionally a resource. You didn't hate them. You barely thought about them at all, except in passing. Their concerns weren't your concerns. Their rules weren't quite meant to apply to you. When your deals cost some of them their jobs, it didn't register as cruelty, because they were never entirely real to you in the way you and your rivals were real to each other. And consequences, in this worldview, were something that happened strictly to other people, to the weak, the slow, the unlucky. Rules were obstacles reserved for the timid, guidelines the truly bold understood to be negotiable. You'd watched too many rules get bent, too many risks pay off spectacularly, to take the idea of limits seriously anymore. The universe, as far as you could tell, was arranged for your benefit, and would go on being arranged that way, because it always had been. It's worth pausing to notice how genuinely intoxicating this was, because it explains so much of the surrounding behavior. To feel yourself one of the anointed, one of the smartest and most important people alive, entitled and untouchable and endlessly ascendant, is a feeling so pleasurable that men will reorganize their entire personalities around protecting it. The spending, the aggression, the refusal to ever rest or reflect, all of it served to defend that feeling, to keep the story of your own supremacy intact and unquestioned. Doubt was the enemy, and doubt was kept firmly outside the door. But a self-worth built entirely on winning has a fatal design flaw, obvious from any distance and completely invisible from inside. It has no foundation beneath the winning itself. It can't survive a loss because losing was never part of the story. It has no place in it, can't be absorbed. As long as the good times kept rolling, the masters of the universe felt like gods. But a god who depends entirely on the weather isn't really a god at all. And the weather in markets, as in everything else, always eventually turns. When it finally did, the men who had built themselves entirely out of victory would discover they had nothing else left standing underneath them. Now we come to the day the music stopped. October 19th, 1987. A date burned permanently into the memory of everyone who lived through it. The market didn't drift downward that day. It fell off a cliff, dropping more in a single session than almost anyone had believed was even possible. It was a collapse so steep and so fast that the men on the floor could only sit and watch their screens in stunned, sweating silence. The shouting stopped. The bravado evaporated. Fortunes vanished in a matter of hours, and the masters of the universe discovered, all at once, that the universe had never actually reported to them at all. The morning began with a low hum of unease, a nervousness that had been quietly building for days. And then that unease became something no one on the floor had ever witnessed before. The market didn't slide gently the way markets sometimes do, giving everyone time to think and react. It simply collapsed. The numbers on the screens started falling and did not stop, plunging further and faster than any model said should have been possible, further than even the oldest hands on the floor had ever seen or imagined. By the end of that single day, the market had shed close to a quarter of its entire value. The steepest one-day decline of its kind in history. A wound so large the mind genuinely struggled to hold it. On the floor, the transformation was total and eerie. The roar that had always defined this place, the shouting, the swagger, the constant electric noise, drained away into something almost worse. A stunned, sweating silence. Men who spent their entire careers bellowing into phones sat frozen, staring at screens delivering worse and worse news by the minute, unable to speak, unable to act, unable to fully comprehend what they were watching. The phones, ordinarily the most important objects in the world, went strangely, unnervingly quiet. Because who exactly was there left to call? And what would you even say to them? Fortunes evaporated in hours, and they evaporated for everyone at once, which was the part that finally broke the spell. This wasn't a clever raider dismantling one unlucky company or a single trader taking a bad hit on a single bad bet. This was the entire market, the entire edifice, dropping out from under all of them simultaneously. And no amount of intelligence or nerve or self-declared superiority made the slightest bit of difference. The wave didn't check anyone's bonus history before it hit. The men who had believed themselves anointed, elevated above ordinary consequence, discovered within the space of a few hours that they were exactly as helpless as anyone else standing in front of a force that didn't know their names and didn't care to learn them. The worldview simply didn't survive the day. All that towering self-regard, that unshakable conviction of superiority, that certainty that the universe had been arranged specifically for your benefit, couldn't absorb what was unfolding on the screens in real time. The universe, it turned out, had never actually reported to any of them. It had simply been having a good run at the same time they were, and they had mistaken coincidence for command. When the run finally turned, it turned on everyone equally, gods and clerks alike. And the gods learned, in one brutal afternoon, that they had never really been gods at all. By the closing bell, the floor had become a different place entirely, hollowed out, quiet, the swagger gone as though it had never existed in the first place. Nobody stood on chairs that day. Nobody shouted legends across the room. The men sat amid the wreckage of a decade's worth of belief, staring at the ruined numbers, slowly beginning to grasp that something enormous had just ended. Not just a single trading day, but an entire way of seeing themselves in the world. The party hadn't been quietly winding down. It had simply been hit by a truck. Let's talk about the morning after, not just the literal one, but the long, slow hangover that followed the entire intoxicated decade. The crash didn't end Wall Street. Of course it didn't. It never quite does. But it punctured something essential. The invincible feeling was gone. Some careers ended overnight. Some ended in courtrooms. Some men walked away with their fortunes intact and their reputations in ruins. And some walked away with nothing at all. The suits stayed sharp, and the ambition never truly died. But the particular flavor of shameless, wired, consequence-free excess that had defined those years had finally, inevitably, run up its bill. And somewhere, quietly, someone was already asking for the check. The crash itself did not destroy Wall Street, and it's important to be honest about that, because Wall Street has always proven remarkably difficult to destroy. The buildings stayed standing. The markets reopened within days. Money continued to be made, and within a surprisingly short stretch of time, much of the lost ground had been recovered. In the narrowest financial sense, the world did not end, but something less measurable had broken, a mood, a spell, a very particular kind of certainty. And that didn't come back along with the numbers. The invincible feeling, the sense of being anointed and untouchable, had been punctured. And you cannot easily reinflate a thing like that once everyone in the room has watched it deflate in real time. For the individuals involved, the reckoning arrived in wildly different forms. Some careers simply ended overnight, wiped out in the crash itself, or in the difficult years that followed, men who'd been untouchable suddenly finding themselves surplus, their desks cleared, their swagger no longer worth anything to anyone. Some careers ended in courtrooms, as the patient investigators finally finished the work they'd started years earlier, and the handcuffs and the headlines did their slow, public work. Some men kept their fortunes, but lost their names, remembered ever after not for their brilliance, but for their disgrace. And some simply walked away with nothing at all, the whole glittering edifice of their identity collapsing right alongside the numbers on their screens. There's a grim kind of justice in how neatly the personal come-down matched the financial one, though justice is perhaps too generous a word for something this indifferent. The entire decade had run on borrowed energy, borrowed money, and borrowed confidence, on a shared refusal to believe any bill would ever actually come due. The powder on the desk, the mountain of debt propping up the deals, the towering self-regard with nothing solid underneath it. All of it was the same bet, over and over, that the good times would last forever, and that consequences were strictly for other people. And all of it, in the end, came due at roughly the same moment, because that is simply what borrowed things eventually do. Not everything died, of course, and it would be a mistake to pretend otherwise. The suits stayed sharp. The ambition, that bottomless engine of want, never actually vanished, because it never does. It simply changes its clothes and goes, looking for a new decade to run wild in. Wall Street rebuilt. It found new instruments, new excesses, new generations of confident young men, each one certain that this time was somehow different. The particular music of the 1980s stopped that October afternoon. But the dance floor was only ever going to stay empty for a little while. That's the one truly reliable thing about the whole business. But the specific flavor of those years, the shameless, wired, consequence-free excess of it, the sincere belief that a small number of men in colorful suspenders were the smartest and most important people who had ever lived, that had finally, inevitably, run its bill. It had been a spectacular party, loud and gleaming, and utterly convinced of itself. And like all such parties, it ended with the lights coming up, and the music dying, and a room full of people blinking slowly at the wreckage. And somewhere in that quiet, someone, at long last, was finally asking for the check. So there you have it, a full day, and a whole decade, in the life of the 1980s Wall Street banker. You woke before dawn in an apartment you barely ever saw, armored yourself in a suit that cost more than a car, and hurled yourself into a roaring floor to shout numbers into a phone until your ear went numb. You feasted on expense accounts, chased a bonus that could never quite be big enough, bought entire companies with their own money, and told yourself, quietly and often, that you were one of the smartest and most important people who had ever lived. And then, on a single gray October morning, the universe you thought reported to you gently reminded you that it never had. It's easy to laugh at them. And we have, gently, all evening, the suspenders, the hair gel, the cologne you could probably smell from space, the towering certainty that consequences were always for someone else. But underneath, the swagger were ordinary human beings, exhausted and hungry for approval, running on borrowed energy and borrowed confidence, chasing a feeling that no bonus and no trophy could ever quite deliver in full. They were ridiculous, yes, but they were also, underneath it, just people wanting to matter, the way people always have. So tonight, as you lie in your own quiet bed, with no market opening to dread tomorrow, and no number to obsess over, maybe let yourself feel a small flicker of gratitude for the simpler pieces of your own life. For a life measured in something other than a scoreboard. For being able to close your eyes without wondering whether the man 2 desks over got more than you did. The party roared, the lights came up, and the check arrived, as it always eventually does. But you don't have to answer for any of it. You can simply rest. Let your shoulders fall. Let the numbers fade, and drift gently off to sleep